Sarah Williams rubbed her tired eyes as she drove home from her 12-hour night shift at Memorial Hospital. The clock on her dashboard showed 11:43 p.m., and the streets of Clayton County were almost empty. Her right hand instinctively moved to her growing belly, where her 6-month-old baby had been particularly active during her shift. Despite her exhaustion, she smiled, thinking about the little one who would join her and her husband Tom in just 3 more months. The autumn air was crisp, and fallen leaves scattered across the road as her modest Honda Civic made its way through the suburban streets. Sarah had taken this route home hundreds of times before, always careful to follow traffic rules, especially now that she was carrying precious cargo. Her hospital scrubs were slightly tight around her belly, and she was looking forward to changing into her comfortable maternity clothes at home. Red and blue lights suddenly flashed in her rearview mirror, causing her heart to skip a beat. Sarah checked her speed. She had been going exactly at the limit. Confused but remaining calm, she signaled and pulled over to the right side of Maple Street, right under a flickering streetlight. Through her mirror, she watched a tall police officer step out of his patrol car. His movements were stiff and deliberate as he approached her vehicle, his hand resting near his holster, a detail that made Sarah unnecessarily nervous. The beam from his flashlight swept across her back window before settling on her driver's side mirror. License and registration, came the gruff voice of Officer James Barrett. His nameplate caught the light as he leaned down to peer into her window. Sarah noticed he looked young, probably in his early 30s, with a clean-shaven face and sharp features that seemed permanently set in a frown. "Good evening, officer," Sarah responded politely, her nursing training kicking in. "Always stay professional, always stay calm. May I ask what the problem is?" "Your right taillight is out," Officer Barrett stated flatly. "Documents, please." Sarah nodded, feeling slightly relieved it was just a taillight. "Of course, let me get those for you." She reached for her purse on the passenger seat, moving slowly and deliberately. The baby chose that moment to kick hard, causing her to wince slightly as she stretched. "Ma'am, keep your hands where I can see them." Officer Barrett's voice suddenly turned sharp, his hand tightening on his holster. "I'm sorry, officer," Sarah said quickly, showing her empty hands. "I'm just reaching for my purse to get my license. I'm 6 months pregnant, so moving is a bit awkward." She tried to inject a light laugh into her voice, hoping to ease the tension. The officer's expression didn't change. "Step out of the vehicle, ma'am." Sarah's heart began to race. "Officer, I don't understand. I was just reaching for my documents." "Step out of the vehicle now," he repeated, his voice taking on an edge that sent chills down Sarah's spine. The street was eerily quiet, with only the hum of the patrol car's engine and the buzz of the flickering streetlight above them. A security camera on the corner store across the street silently recorded the scene, its red light blinking steadily in the darkness. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she unbuckled her seatbelt. Her mind raced through all the news stories she'd seen about traffic stops gone wrong, but she pushed those thoughts aside. She was a law-abiding citizen, a registered nurse, and surely this was just a misunderstanding that would be cleared up quickly. As she carefully opened her door, her pregnant belly made the simple action of getting out more challenging than usual. The cool night air hit her face as she stood up, one hand supporting her back, the other instinctively protecting her belly. Officer Barrett stood a few feet away, his posture rigid and authoritative. The contrast between them couldn't have been starker, a pregnant nurse in medical scrubs versus a uniformed officer whose hand hadn't left his weapon since he'd approached her car. What neither of them knew was that this moment, the seemingly routine traffic stop on a quiet suburban street, would soon spiral into a series of events that would shock the community and spark a nationwide conversation about police conduct. The security camera continued its silent vigil, recording what would soon become crucial evidence in a case that would change both their lives forever. The tension in the air thickened as Sarah stood beside her car, the autumn wind whipping through her scrubs. Officer Barrett's flashlight beam moved across her body, lingering on her hospital ID badge and her visible baby bump. The store's security camera across the street continued its silent recording, capturing every moment of what was about to unfold. "Turn around and face your vehicle," Officer Barrett commanded, his voice carrying an unnecessary edge. Sarah complied slowly, her heart pounding. The baby inside her moved restlessly, as if sensing her growing anxiety. "Officer, please," Sarah said calmly, using the same soothing voice she used with agitated patients. "I'm happy to show you my documents. They're right there in my purse on the passenger seat." She pointed carefully, keeping her other hand visible. Two teenagers walking their dog on the opposite sidewalk slowed down, sensing something wasn't right. The taller one, a girl with a red hoodie, pulled out her phone and began recording. Her friend whispered something, but stayed close, their dog sitting obediently at their feet. "I didn't ask you to speak," Barrett snapped, moving closer. "Put your hands on the hood." The beam of his flashlight shook slightly, betraying a tremor in his hand that didn't match his aggressive tone. Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes but fought to stay composed. "Sir, I'm a nurse at Memorial Hospital. I'm just heading home from my shift. Please check my ID. On the hood, now." Barrett's voice rose sharply, echoing off the surrounding buildings. The nearby convenience store's clerk, Mr. Patel, looked up from his counter, drawn by the commotion. He moved closer to his window, phone already in hand. Sarah carefully placed her hands on the hood, the cold metal seeping through her palms. Her pregnant belly made it awkward to lean forward, and she struggled to find a comfortable position. "Officer, this position is very difficult for me due to my pregnancy. Could we please?" "Stop resisting." Barrett's words cut through the night air like a knife. Sarah froze, confused and frightened. She wasn't resisting at all. She was simply trying to accommodate her pregnant body while following his orders. More phones appeared in windows and doorways of nearby homes. The teenagers across the street had been joined by others who emerged from the convenience store, all recording the escalating situation. Mr. Paddle had stepped outside his shop, his phone held high. "I'm going to check your vehicle for contraband," Barrett announced, his footsteps crunching on fallen leaves as he moved toward the passenger side. "Don't move." "Officer, please." Sarah's voice cracked with emotion. "My purse has all my ID. I'm just a nurse. I'm pregnant. This is unnecessary." Barrett spun around, his face contorted with what appeared to be a mix of fear and anger. "I said don't move." His right hand gripped his holster tighter, causing several onlookers to gasp. The growing crowd of witnesses murmured in disbelief. Someone in the distance shouted, "She's pregnant, man. Take it easy." Another voice called out, "We're recording everything." Sarah's arms trembled as she maintained her uncomfortable position on the hood. Tears now fell freely down her face, but she remained as still as possible. The baby kicked hard, causing her to shift slightly to maintain her balance. Officer Barrett interpreted this small movement as defiance. He strode back toward her, his boots hitting the pavement with purposeful steps. "That's it. Put your hands behind your back." "Please," Sarah sobbed. "I'm not doing anything wrong. I'm 6 months pregnant. Please just check my ID." The sound of handcuffs unclipping from Barrett's belt cut through the night air. The crowd grew larger, their phones capturing every moment. Mr. Patel was now openly shouting, "This is wrong. She is customer. Good person." What happened next would be played on news channels across the country within hours. The security camera's unwavering eye and dozens of cell phones recorded the moment that would change both Officer Barrett's career and Sarah's life forever. None of the witnesses could have predicted that this routine traffic stop on a quiet suburban street would become the spark that ignited a nationwide debate about police conduct and the treatment of pregnant women by law enforcement. The crowd watched in horror as Officer Barrett grabbed Sarah's wrist, twisting it behind her back with unnecessary force. Her pregnant body awkwardly pressed against the car hood as she cried out in pain. The baby kicked violently inside her, responding to her distress. "Stop resisting," Barrett shouted, though the cell phone videos clearly showed Sarah wasn't fighting back at all. Her scrubs were now wet with tears as she struggled to maintain her balance, trying desperately to protect her unborn child from being crushed against the vehicle. "I'm not resisting." Sarah sobbed, "Please, my baby. You're hurting my baby." Her medical training kicked in. She knew the dangers this stress and physical force could pose to her pregnancy. The crowd's angry voices grew louder, but Barrett seemed oblivious to everything except his perceived need to establish control. Mr. Patel, the store owner, had already dialed 911. "Emergency, emergency," he shouted into his phone. "Police officer is attacking pregnant nurse. Corner of Maple and 5th. Send help now." His free hand still held up his phone, recording everything. The teenagers who had first stopped to watch were now streaming the incident live on social media. Comments and reactions flooded in real time as viewers across the city watched the scene unfold. "That's Sarah from Memorial," someone commented. "She helped deliver my baby last month." Suddenly, Barrett's grip shifted, and Sarah lost her balance. Time seemed to slow down as she began to fall. Several witnesses screamed as Barrett failed to properly support her, instead roughly yanking her arm as she slipped. Sarah's nursing instincts took over. She twisted her body to avoid landing on her stomach, taking the impact on her side instead. "Oh my God!" Multiple voices screamed from the crowd. The thud of Sarah's body hitting the pavement echoed through the street. Barrett stood over her, still holding her arm at an awkward angle, seemingly unsure what to do next. A man in medical scrubs pushed through the crowd. "I'm a doctor," he shouted, running toward Sarah. "Let me help her." It was Dr. James Chen, who had just finished his shift at the same hospital and had stopped at the convenience store for coffee. "Stay back," Barrett warned, pulling out his taser. The crowd gasped collectively. Dr. Chen raised his hands but didn't retreat. "Officer, she's a pregnant nurse. I'm her colleague. Please, she needs medical attention immediately." Dr. Chen's voice was firm but professional. Sarah lay on her side, conscious but crying in pain, both hands now cradling her belly. More police sirens wailed in the distance. Mr. Patel's emergency call had gotten through. The growing crowd now numbered over 50 people, all with phones raised, all recording. Some were calling local news stations. Others were already uploading videos to social media platforms. "She's bleeding," someone shouted. A small trickle of blood had appeared on Sarah's leg, visible through her light blue scrubs. The sight of blood seemed to finally break through Barrett's aggressive stance. His face changed as the reality of the situation appeared to hit him. Two police cars screeched to a halt at the scene. Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, a 20-year veteran, jumped out and quickly assessed the situation. "Barrett, stand down," she commanded. "What the hell are you doing?" Dr. Chen rushed to Sarah's side as Barrett finally stepped back. "Sarah, don't move," the doctor instructed calmly. "Help is coming." He checked her pulse while speaking quietly to her, trying to keep her calm. Sergeant Rodriguez was already on her radio. "I need an ambulance at Maple and 5th, priority 1. Pregnant woman down, possible complications." She turned to Barrett, her face tight with controlled anger. "Give me your badge and gun, now." The crowd continued recording as an ambulance's siren grew closer. Sarah's breathing was rapid and shallow, signs of shock that Dr. Chen recognized immediately. The baby's movements, which she could usually feel strongly, had become worryingly faint. This moment, a pregnant nurse lying injured on the cold pavement, surrounded by angry witnesses, with a doctor kneeling beside her and a disgraced officer being disarmed by his sergeant, would become the defining image of a national conversation about police brutality. Within hours, millions would watch the videos, and Sarah's story would become a rallying cry for change. The emergency room at Memorial Hospital buzzed with activity as Sarah received treatment, but outside, a different kind of storm was brewing. Within 3 hours of the incident, the videos had spread like wildfire across every social media platform. By sunrise, Sarah's story was no longer just local news. It had become a national headline. Maria Torres, a local community activist, stood outside the police station at 7 a.m., megaphone in hand. She hadn't slept all night after watching the videos. Behind her, a crowd of over 200 people gathered, holding hastily made signs reading "Protect Pregnant Women" and "Justice for Nurse Sarah." When a pregnant nurse can't drive home safely from her shift, something is deeply wrong. Maria's voice boomed across the crowd. Many of the protesters were Sarah's colleagues from Memorial Hospital, still wearing their scrubs from the night shift. They had come straight from work, their faces showing both exhaustion and anger. Inside the hospital, Sarah's room quickly filled with flowers and cards. Her husband Tom hadn't left her side since arriving at the emergency room. The baby's heartbeat was being monitored constantly, the steady beep of the machine providing some comfort after the traumatic night. "Look at this," Tom said softly, showing Sarah his phone. The original video had already been viewed 5 million times. Celebrity activists were sharing it and demanding action. Hashtag Justice for Nurse Sarah was trending nationwide. Sarah closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the attention. Dr. Chen, who had helped her at the scene, became an important voice in the media coverage. As medical professionals, we're trained to protect life, he told reporters gathered outside the hospital. What I witnessed last night was the opposite of protection. It was a complete disregard for both mother and unborn child. By noon, the crowd outside the police station had grown to over 1,000 people. A hospital's nursing union announced a protest of their own, with nurses from 3 other local hospitals joining in solidarity. They set up a schedule to ensure the protests wouldn't affect patient care. Nurses would join before or after their shifts. Local business owners near the site of the incident shared their security footage with news stations. Mr. Patel's convenience store video provided the clearest view of the entire incident. I see Nurse Sarah every night, he told reporters, wiping tears from his eyes. She always smiles, always kind. Even buys food for homeless people sometimes. This should never happen. The teenagers who first recorded the incident were interviewed by several news channels. We knew something was wrong right away, Jenny Martinez, the girl in the red hoodie, explained. A pregnant woman in scrubs clearly isn't a threat. We started recording because we were scared for her. Social media exploded with similar stories from other pregnant women who had experienced aggressive police encounters. Sarah's incident had opened a floodgate of shared experiences. Women's rights organizations and civil rights groups issued joint statements demanding immediate police reform. By evening, the city mayor called an emergency press conference. What happened to Sarah Williams is unacceptable, she declared firmly. I've ordered a complete review of our police department's protocols, especially regarding their treatment of pregnant women and medical professionals. The police chief stood uncomfortably beside the mayor, looking tired and defensive. Officer Barrett's actions do not reflect our department's values, he stated. He has been suspended pending a full investigation. The crowd at the press conference responded with angry shouts, demanding more immediate action. Back at the hospital, Sarah's fellow nurses organized a protective circle around her room, ensuring no unauthorized people could enter. They coordinated their breaks to maintain a constant presence. She takes care of patients every day, said Nancy Chen, head nurse of the maternal ward. Now it's our turn to take care of her. As the sun set on that first day after the incident, the city remained in uproar. Candlelight vigils were organized outside the hospital. Social media continued to buzz with outrage and calls for justice. What had started as one violent encounter had evolved into a movement, shining a spotlight on the intersection of police conduct, women's rights, and the safety of healthcare workers. Sarah lay in her hospital bed, one hand on her belly feeling her baby's movements, while outside her window, thousands of voices rose in unity, demanding change. This was no longer just her story. It had become a catalyst for a much larger conversation about power, protection, and justice in America. The police department's internal affairs office buzzed with activity early Monday morning. Detective Lisa Martinez sat at her desk, surrounded by screens showing different angles of the incident. After 30 years on the force, she thought she had seen everything, but the footage of Officer Barrett's arrest of Sarah Williams made her stomach turn. Play it again, she instructed her assistant, focusing on Barrett's body camera footage. The timestamp showed 11:47 p.m., just 4 minutes after the initial stop. Every movement, every word was now under intense scrutiny. As head of internal affairs, Lisa knew this case would define her career. On her desk lay Officer Barrett's personnel file. It wasn't his first complaint, but the previous ones had been minor: rudeness, excessive traffic citations, overly aggressive tone. Nothing that had raised serious red flags. Until now. Lisa rubbed her temples, wondering how they had missed the warning signs. Detective Martinez, her assistant, called from the door. Officer Barrett's previous supervisor is here. Lisa nodded, gathering her notes. Sergeant Mike Thompson had supervised Barrett during his first 2 years on the force. His insight could be crucial. In the interview room, Thompson looked uncomfortable. Barrett was always intense, he admitted, adjusting his collar. Took every situation too personally. I tried to mentor him, teach him to dial it back, but he trailed off, watching the footage play on the wall screen. Meanwhile, in another part of the building, tech specialists were analyzing Barrett's phone records and social media history. What they found was troubling: a pattern of following aggressive police tactics accounts, comments supporting excessive force, and concerning posts about women in authority positions. "Look at this," one tech analyst called out. She had found Barrett's gym records through his phone data. His steroid use had been carefully hidden, but the evidence was there: purchases, messages to suppliers, side effects documented in his personal notes. The pieces were starting to fit together. By afternoon, Lisa had interviewed 4 other officers who had worked with Barrett. Each interview revealed new concerns that had gone unreported. Officer Sarah Chen remembered how Barrett had once made disparaging remarks about pregnant women taking too much medical leave. Officer James Rodriguez recalled an incident where Barrett had been unnecessarily rough with a female driver, but the woman hadn't filed a complaint. "Why didn't anyone report these incidents?" Lisa demanded, frustration evident in her voice. The wall of silence among officers was finally cracking, but too late to prevent Sarah Williams' trauma. At 3 p.m., the police chief called an emergency meeting with all department heads. The preliminary findings were damning. Barrett's psychological evaluation from 3 years ago had shown signs of aggression and control issues, but he'd been cleared for juvie anyway. The department psychologist who had approved him was now under investigation too. "This goes beyond one bad officer," Lisa explained to the room full of superior officers. "We have systemic failures in our reporting system, our supervision protocols, and our psychological screening." The chief's face grew darker with each point she made. Outside, protesters continued their vigil, but inside, the real change was beginning. Lisa's team drafted new protocols for officer screening, particularly focusing on attitudes toward pregnant women and medical professionals. They proposed mandatory quarterly psychological evaluations and a complete overhaul of the complaint investigation system. By evening, Lisa interviewed Barrett himself. He sat across from her, still defending his actions. "I followed protocol," he insisted, but his hands shook as he watched the footage. When Lisa showed him the image of Sarah Williams in her hospital bed, surrounded by monitors checking her baby's heartbeat, he finally fell silent. The investigation revealed more than just one officer's misconduct. It exposed a culture of silence and a system that had failed both the public and its own officers. Lisa's report would recommend not only Barrett's termination, but a complete restructuring of the department's training and supervision programs. As she finished typing her preliminary report at midnight, Lisa glanced at the photo of her own daughter on her desk, a young police officer in another state. "We have to do better," she whispered, adding her signature to the document that would change their department forever. The internal investigation had uncovered not just what went wrong that night, but why it had been allowed to happen. Now came the harder part, making sure it never happened again. The quiet beeping of hospital monitors filled room 304 of Memorial Hospital's high-risk pregnancy unit. Sarah Williams lay in her bed, her hands protectively cradling her belly. It had been 3 days since the incident, but her body was now telling her something wasn't right. "Tom," she whispered, waking her sleeping husband in the chair beside her. "Get Dr. Anderson. The baby's movements feel different." Tom jumped up immediately, his tired eyes showing fresh worry. Within minutes, Dr. Emily Anderson rushed into the room, her white coat flowing behind her. "Sarah, tell me exactly what you're feeling," Dr. Anderson said, quickly checking the monitors. The baby's heart rate showed subtle but concerning changes. As a nurse herself, Sarah knew these signs. She had seen them in her own patients, but now they were happening to her. "The kicks are weaker," Sarah explained professionally, trying to stay calm. "And there's this pressure that wasn't there before." Her medical knowledge was both a blessing and a curse in this moment. She understood too well what could go wrong. Dr. Anderson's face grew serious as she performed an ultrasound. The screen showed their baby girl, but her movements were indeed less vigorous than they should be. The trauma from the violent arrest had caused complications they had feared. The placenta was showing signs of partial separation. "We need to start medications right away," Dr. Anderson announced, already writing orders. "Sarah, I'm putting you on complete bed rest. We have to try to keep this baby inside for at least another few weeks." Outside the hospital room, news vans remained parked along the street. Sarah's story had become national news, and medical experts across the country were speaking out about the dangers of police violence against pregnant women. Dr. Chen, who had helped Sarah at the scene, was being interviewed by a major news network. The physical trauma of being thrown to the ground could have killed both mother and baby, he explained to millions of viewers. We're now dealing with serious complications that never should have happened. Inside the hospital, a team of specialists worked together to save Sarah's pregnancy. Nurses who had worked alongside her now cared for her, their faces showing both professional focus and personal concern. Many had tears in their eyes as they administered medications and checked vital signs. By evening, the situation became more critical. Sarah's contractions started, despite the medications trying to prevent them. No, 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 she whispered, squeezing Tom's hand. It's too early. She's too small. At just 24 weeks, their baby's chances of survival would be challenged. Dr. Anderson ordered more medications and called in additional specialists. The neonatal intensive care team was put on standby. Sarah's room became a center of intense medical activity as doctors and nurses fought to prevent premature labor. Your baby is a fighter, just like her mama, Nurse Maria Rodriguez told Sarah while adjusting her IV medications. Maria had trained under Sarah 2 years ago. Now she was fighting to save her mentor's baby. The night grew tenser as Sarah's condition worsened. The baby's heart rate showed occasional drops, each one sending alarms through the monitors and fear through everyone's hearts. Tom never left her side, his face showing the helplessness of watching his wife and unborn child struggle. At midnight, Sarah developed a fever. Dr. Anderson ordered antibiotics, worried about infection. The medical team worked tirelessly, using every tool and treatment available. Sarah drifted in and out of sleep, each time waking to check the monitors herself. By dawn, the medications finally started working. The contractions slowed, and the baby's heart rate stabilized. Sarah's fever broke, bringing cautious relief to the exhausted medical team, but they knew they weren't out of danger yet. We got through the night, Dr. Anderson told Sarah and Tom as sunlight began filtering through the window. But we have a long road ahead. This baby needs to stay inside as long as possible. Outside the hospital, the story of Sarah's medical crisis added fuel to the growing outrage. Medical organizations issued statements about the dangers of police violence during pregnancy. Protesters now included doctors and nurses from across the country, all demanding change. Sarah lay in her hospital bed, listening to the distant chants from protesters below her window. Her hand never left her belly, feeling each precious movement of her baby. The medical crisis wasn't over, but for now, they had hope. Each day the baby stayed inside was a victory they would fight for minute by minute. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters as attorney Michelle Rodriguez walked up, carrying her well-worn leather briefcase. She had been fighting civil rights cases for 20 years, but Sarah Williams' case felt different. The security footage played on her mind as she entered the building, a pregnant nurse thrown to the ground over a broken taillight. Inside courtroom 302, Sarah sat between her husband Tom and Michelle. Her baby bump was now 7 months along, and she kept one protective hand on it throughout the proceedings. Despite her ongoing medical complications, she had insisted on being present for this hearing. "All rise," the bailiff called out. Judge Catherine Chen entered, her face serious as she surveyed the packed courtroom. On one side sat Sarah and her legal team. On the other, Officer Barrett and his police union lawyers, along with representatives from the city's legal department. "Your Honor," Michelle began, standing confidently. "The evidence in this case is overwhelming. We have video footage from multiple angles showing Officer Barrett using excessive force against a visibly pregnant woman who posed no threat." She gestured to the large screen where Mr. Patel's security camera footage began to play. The courtroom fell silent as they watched the incident unfold. Several jurors visibly winced when Sarah hit the ground. Even Barrett's own lawyers seemed uncomfortable, shifting in their seats as the footage continued. "Not only do we have video evidence," Michelle continued, "but we have testimony from Dr. James Chen, who witnessed the incident and provided immediate medical care. We have documented proof of the ongoing medical complications Mrs. Williams and her unborn child still face." Barrett's lead attorney, Jack Thompson, tried to argue that his client had followed department protocols, but his arguments felt weak against the mountain of evidence. The internal affairs investigation had revealed Barrett's history of aggressive behavior and concealed steroid use. During a break in proceedings, Sarah stepped out into the hallway for air. She overheard 2 other police officers talking quietly. "Barrett makes us all look bad," One whispered, "We're supposed to protect people, not hurt pregnant women." Their words confirmed what Michelle had been arguing. This case was changing perspectives even within the police department. The district attorney's office had their own proceedings running parallel to the civil case. Assistant DA Sarah Martinez was building a criminal case against Barrett. The state intends to charge Officer Barrett with assault, reckless endangerment of an unborn child, and official misconduct, she announced to reporters outside the courthouse. Back in the courtroom, medical experts testified about the dangers Sarah and her baby had faced. Dr. Anderson presented detailed records of the complications caused by the violent arrest. Any unnecessary force against a pregnant woman can have catastrophic consequences, she explained to the jury. Mrs. Williams and her baby could have died. Barrett sat stiffly in his chair, his face showing no emotion as witness after witness testified against him. His own body camera footage proved particularly damaging, capturing his aggressive tone and actions from the very beginning of the traffic stop. During her testimony, Sarah spoke quietly but firmly about that night. "I was just trying to show him my ID," she explained, her voice steady. "I told him repeatedly that I was pregnant. I begged him to just check my credentials. Instead, he chose violence." Several jurors wiped tears from their eyes as she described her ongoing medical struggles. The city's lawyers, seeing the writing on the wall, approached Michelle during lunch break. "We want to discuss a settlement," they said quietly. But Sarah shook her head when Michelle told her. "This isn't about money," she insisted. "This is about making sure it never happens to another woman." By late afternoon, Judge Chen had heard enough. "This court finds sufficient evidence to proceed with both civil and criminal cases," she declared. "Officer Barrett will remain suspended without pay pending criminal trial, and the civil case will move forward." Outside the courthouse, as the sun set on another long day of proceedings, Michelle addressed the waiting reporters. "Today marks the beginning of justice for Sarah Williams," she announced. "But more importantly, it marks the beginning of necessary change in how law enforcement treats pregnant women." Sarah stood beside her attorney, tired but determined. The baby kicked strongly, a good sign after weeks of worry. The legal battle was far from over, but each day brought them closer to justice and, hopefully, to changing a system that had failed to protect its most vulnerable citizens. 6 months after the incident, Sarah Williams stood at a podium in front of City Hall, her healthy 3-month-old daughter Emma sleeping peacefully in a baby carrier against her chest. The crowd before her included nurses, police officers, community activists, and hundreds of citizens who had followed her story from the beginning. "Today, we're not just changing policies," Sarah spoke into the microphones, her voice strong and clear. "We're changing how our community protects its most vulnerable members." Behind her, the mayor prepared to sign the Williams Protection Act, a comprehensive set of new laws governing police interactions with pregnant women and medical professionals. Officer Barrett had been convicted 2 months earlier, receiving a 5-year prison sentence. But for Sarah, that was just the beginning. She had transformed her traumatic experience into a powerful movement for change, working with both police officials and medical professionals to develop new training programs. "Every officer in our city will now receive specialized training," Police Chief Rodriguez announced, stepping up to the podium after Sarah. "We've completely redesigned our approach to traffic stops, with specific protocols for pregnant women and healthcare workers." The chief, hired after her predecessor's resignation, was herself a mother who understood the importance of these changes. In the crowd, Mr. Paddle watched proudly. His convenience store had become a symbol of the importance of community surveillance. The security camera that captured Sarah's assault now bore a small plaque. "Justice sees everything." He had transformed his store into a safe haven where anyone feeling threatened could seek help. Dr. Chen, who had helped Sarah that night, now led a new hospital program training police officers about medical emergencies and pregnant women's needs. "Officers spend 3 days working alongside nurses," he explained to a reporter. "They learn firsthand about the challenges and vulnerabilities of pregnancy. It changes their perspective completely." The changes spread beyond their city. Police departments across the country began adopting the Williams Protocol for traffic stops involving pregnant women. Medical organizations created new guidelines for protecting healthcare workers during their commutes. Sarah's story had sparked a national conversation about police reform and maternal safety. Back at Memorial Hospital, where Sarah had returned to work part-time, a new security system ensured safe parking and escorts for night shift workers. The break room wall displayed a framed copy of the Williams Protection Act, signed by everyone who had supported her through the crisis. "Watch this," Tom said softly to baby Emma as they stood in the crowd. Sarah was now demonstrating the new police training program. She worked with officers, teaching them appropriate ways to interact with pregnant women during traffic stops. Even some of Barrett's former colleagues admitted the training opened their eyes to better ways of handling situations. The hospital's nursing union had created a legal defense fund for healthcare workers, named after Sarah. "We protect those who protect others," read their motto. The fund had already helped 3 other nurses who faced similar situations in different cities. Local schools now included Sarah's story in their civil rights curriculum. Students learned about the power of community action and the importance of standing up for justice. Jenny Martinez, one of the teenagers who first recorded the incident, had been inspired to study law. "The most important change," Sarah told the crowd, adjusting sleeping Emma in her carrier, "is in how we see each other. Police officers are learning to be protectors, not just enforcers. Communities are learning to watch out for each other. Hospitals are learning to better protect their staff." Mr. Paddle's security camera footage had been donated to the City Museum's Civil Rights exhibition. Next to it, a timeline showed the changes that had occurred because of one traffic stop on a quiet autumn night. Visitors often stood silently, watching the footage, then reading about the reforms it inspired. As Sarah concluded her speech, the crowd erupted in applause. Emma woke briefly, her tiny hand reaching up to touch her mother's face. In that moment, looking at her daughter, Sarah remembered the fear of that night and the long medical crisis that followed. But now, those memories were balanced by the knowledge that her experience had created lasting change. "This is your legacy, too," she whispered to Emma as the mayor stepped forward to sign the new laws. The autumn wind carried the sound of cheering across the city. A city forever changed by one woman's courage and a community's determination to protect its own.